Hello, friends, and welcome to the Doing What Matters podcast. It's great to be back with you again this week. I'm your host, Teresa McCloy.
And I'm your co host, Erica Vinson. And we are absolutely thrilled that you're listening in today as we dive into discussions about life, business, and lots of things that truly matter.
So, here on the podcast, we really want to embrace a holistic approach to living, a way of life that's rooted in rest, not rush. It's about connecting to our real self, our real life, and our real work, and remembering who God uniquely created us to be and redefining success through a different lens.
Whether you're here to find inspiration, practical advice, or just a moment of connection, we're thankful you're here. Let's dive into today's conversation. Well, Teresa, I know that you've been back on the road again and just returned from the Podfest Conference where you were a featured speaker. And share with us some wisdom. We always love to glean those nuggets when you go away and return. What did you learn?
Well, thank you for asking. And I did, when I got back, I shared with Erica that I wanted to share a little bit of one of my takeaways from Podfest. And it was actually totally different than all the techie, geeky stuff that was there. Been in the podcasting world now for almost 7 years. And it was fun to go. And it's a pretty large conference. There was probably almost 1,500 people there. And to just go and kind of geek out on all the gadgets and the stuff. And my favorite part, though, is the relationship piece. So I got to be with several friends. But one of the things that caught me off guard at the conference that I was not expecting was a night that they actually did called the Hall of Fame, where they inducted 11 members into the podcasting Hall of Fame. Now, who knew there was such a thing? They even had I want to say acrylic. I'm sure they were glass or something special, but like little statues for them. And I felt like I was at the Emmys and didn't have to pay the big bucks. But it was a really cool evening. But it was neat to really reflect and think back about, I just podcast. I just, hit record and play and all the technology that's been invented literally and come into play to make things like this available around the world. And that was some of the things that blew me away. So I'd love to dive into this idea of like legacy and who has gone before you to just pave the way and make it really easy for you to do whatever work it is that you do out in the world.
Yeah, I love that.
Let me just start with this, just to kind of set the stage. There was a moment where one of the guys that was inducted into the Hall of Fame is actually, and this won't make sense unless you're a podcaster, but was actually the guy who invented Libsyn. Well, Libsyn is the company that hosts podcasts and makes them go out to all of these different platforms. So I literally take my podcast, I put it on, a platform, and it goes to iTunes, and it goes to Spotify, and it goes to Amazon, and it goes to about 15 or 20 other places where you can find our podcast. So this guy was actually part, and he just talked about the story almost like you hear Mark Zuckerberg talk about Facebook. Like we were in our dorm room just trying to figure out technology for ourselves, not even knowing that it would impact a whole culture and a whole world. And so it really struck me as I'd never thought about like who invented this? Who came up with this idea? And yet we work in all these different industries and don't give it any thought, like who had to blaze a trail before us to make what we do so much easier, so much more accessible, or even a household name. And we just get to ride on the coattails of that,
Mm.
so to speak. So may not intrigue anyone else, but it really intrigued me that night. And I will say I sat there very grateful. Another unique thing that I learned from this whole conference is how much interest people in the world have around very, very niche topics and hobbies. So, two of the men that were inducted into the Hall of Fame, one of them, it's
Mm.
called the Horse Network. and he's a real tall, lanky guy with a cowboy hat on. He's been podcasting about horses since like 2000, and we're in 2025. Like, that's a lot of talk about horses, right? And yet he was a trailblazer, haha, on
Literally.
words there, literally, around another guy that was inducted in was all around travel. And he is literally, as I don't even remember the name of the podcast now, but it's all around travel. And all he does is go on trips and travel and then come back and talk about them and
Mm.
where he went and where he stayed. And you and I both love to travel. So, I was signing up for that podcast immediately. But just this idea of people have been talking and doing these kinds of podcasts really got me thinking too, in the business perspective, about the work you do matters to somebody,
That's a good word.
but it doesn't need to matter to everybody.
Mm.
And so we get hung up sometimes on any type of work we're doing that I'm not reaching enough people. And that was one of the things they said. And I think every business needs to hear that in any work we're doing: consistency. These guys have been doing this kind of thing for 25 years. It's a really long time.
Well, even the imagery of trailblazing, I mean, to actually have a trail, it's like you have to go back and be consistent. You have to repetitively put things out there and try and fail and find a way.
And they were doing that. And so you could say that about any industry that you think of. Somebody did it first, somebody created a way for that to be done, whether it's something like a Facebook or podcasting, or even in the world that you and I live in, which is the industry of coaching and showing up in that way. It hasn't been around that long
Mm,
when you go back and look at it. And you and I have both been impacted by some people in that industry that have paved the way, so to speak, for coaching.
absolutely. And I think even, going back even into ministry and serving together there, looking towards pioneers in the field, women in ministry who've impacted
Mhm.
our journey, in a broader sense and then in a very personal sense
So that's
as well.
interesting that you say that and bring that up, because that's a really good point too. When I went to college lots of years ago, 40 some years ago, and I actually didn't have a way. I did attend a Christian college, and I didn't have a way to use music in the way that I wanted to. If you wanted to go to college for music in a Christian college space, you were going probably for performance, nothing like a worship pastor, worship minister,
Mhm.
creative arts. None of that had even been thought of. And so that came full circle for me, you know, 20 years later, when I did start working in full-time ministry space as a creative arts minister. And you and I both were women in ministry in the area of the country that we lived in that was not the norm for us to be on staff and be women in full-time pastoral roles. So yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. And maybe that's why I was drawn to this observation that I have at Podfest. We might reflect back on, as you're listening to this podcast, like, where are places that you've been given the opportunity to kind of be a trailblazer in your season of life, or be a pioneer in that space. Before we go too far, though, I do want to give a shout out, a true shout out on the podcast, because, I'm grateful for some people in my life that have been that before me. Erica and I talked, you know, we just mentioned the coaching space. Chris McCluskey, who founded Professional Christian Coaching Institute. Who else is somebody, Erica, that's been a pioneer for you?
Yeah, Cheryl Scanlon, Andrew Gorder.
Absolutely. And those are people that have just shown us ways of doing coaching work, of showing up well in our profession, of teaching us well. All three of them have been impactful. Many others. I would give a shout out to Kim Avery's another one. What are other places, Erica, that you've seen people just be that legacy piece or pioneer piece for you?
Well, looking back at a couple of different careers prior to even coaching for me in the teaching space, I mean, Davies Bellamy, who was my instructor from Trinidad and Tobago at University of Evansville, Amy McBride, They were just people that not just wanted me to learn the information about teaching, but they wanted me to embody what was it like to actually be a teacher and to really impact lives and to be transformed by the information that I was learning. And so both of them were huge influences in my teaching career. As I think about the ministry space, Nancy Beach, as we were talking about pioneering, Nancy was on a large church staff as a female doing the creative arts work that I know inspired you. And then I was able to do a women in leadership coaching group with her and a coaching circle program with 12 other women across the United States and Canada. And just incredible impact in really helping to push forward what I was able to do, not only as a personally, but in my professional world, just launching into a new space as well.
So, interestingly enough, today in one of our membership programs that we have, the Real Life Practice membership, which is really it's a opposite program kind of from even the conversations we have here. It's much on the being and the spiritual growth side, whereas, even in this podcast we're talking more from the doing side of things and how we're showing up in the world through our doing. This particular membership, we have a call every month where we walk through a book, and we just started it. We are going through the book Practicing the Way by John Mark Comer. And the very beginning of the book talks about, the rabbi, Jesus being the rabbi, and the apprentice. And it really brought me full circle to this idea of watching these guys get inducted into the Hall of Fame, and that, they have been in their industry in some ways. And we talked about this on the call today, that we have rabbis, so to speak, that we're following. Are we following the right one? That was a whole spiritual conversation. But that most of us don't care how long you went to college or what degrees you have. There was somebody that took you under their wing and grew you as a leader, grew you as a professional. I've had a lot of different careers and occupations, and everywhere along the way, the reason I've grown and become, a leader in that space or whatever was either somebody came alongside of me or I went and sought out, like you were just talking about Nancy Beach's program. One of my mentors, long-term mentors, is Sybil Towner. And, I've sought out people to walk alongside of me. I talk about that in the book about Rory Noland and hiring him to teach me in the church space how to be a leader. In my early careers, I was in a lot of sales type companies and in home sales companies. And I had people like Linda Hollands-Ed, who I still am friends with on Facebook. So some of the beauty of the things that we have is we can still stay in connection with some of these people. And interestingly, Erica, as I'm thinking about this right now, and I shared this with someone a few weeks ago, while I was on sabbatical, one of the things I did was clean out lots of things in my home. And I realized how much I have learned through books.
Mhm.
And, it was kind of sad to go through all the books I've had and think, oh, people can get these now on Kindle and they can get these in so many other places. Like, I'm not doing this occupation anymore. I don't need all of these books. Or my kids have grown out of that phase. I don't need all these books. And yet they're available everywhere to people. And so finding where I could take them, what I could do with them. But I realized I did a lot of my learning and mentorship and legacy work through books. I think I've read every John Maxwell book there ever was written, and I did not get rid of those. And today in a networking group I'm in here locally, we're going to do a book club together. And they came back around and mentioned, let's do 21 Laws of Leadership. And I'm like, wow, that's still like that classic. Oh, you think about someone like him and the work that he's contributed and all that, people have learned. So we have these mentors, I think, and these pioneers in lots of different places in our lives.
Yeah. Well, and you think about too, just the learning from books, it allowed you before podcasting was even a thing to sit in the presence, and really just be, with another person as you're learning. And then the gift of, I think about Ruth Haley Barton and have read many of her books, sat under her teaching, and the gift that it is to not only read, but then to go, oh, now I can actually hear her voice,
Yes.
as one who has taught and one who continues to go before me. And it's so much more impactful when we're able to be in proximity, but also really personally have those connections.
Yeah, and Ruth is another one that I think was a pioneer, in the spiritual formation space and the
Mhm.
leadership space, and really teaching and training leaders to come up for air, live from rest, not rush, as we talk about so much. So I could go to a conference and I could learn lots of different things. But that night, as I was sitting there in that room, and like I said, it felt like the Emmys, and, we're listening to people give their thank yous and say all these things. The other thing I noticed was the commonality of all 11 people and just how grateful they were,
Mm,
even surprised to be recognized. Some had created things like, a platform that would host podcast. Others had done long-term things, but they all had contributed to a community of moving a movement forward. And I think that's interesting too, how so many people that are impactful in ways, they all knew each other and had become drawn to each other
mm.
because they believed in the power of, the medium that they were creating. But it was so cool, I think, for them to even be in that space together. And so just reflect on this is kind of a reflective invitation because we don't always say thank you. Or I got to talk to one of the guys afterwards and just say thank you, like for doing what you did, because sometimes we just live in our lives and don't think, you know,
Yeah.
who made that happen? Who made that way for me? So,
Yeah,
just
it's the ripple
time.
effect.
Yeah. The ripple effect, absolutely. And then to take time to not only thank those who may have gone, but then just reflect on who am I creating a legacy for?
Mhm.
And who, where am I paving a path for someone else?
Mm.
Um, and you may think that's not me. I'm not that kind of leader. I think you would be surprised if you really, it could just be within your own home, you know, people in your lives in a small circle. It may not be like the guy said from Lipson, we were doing it in our dorm room with 5 other people. We never realized, like, you just don't know the ripple effect and the impact that you're having.
Yeah, I recently heard someone say, I always have people who are ahead of me. And so who is ahead of you? Who's walking beside you? And then who is behind you that you're paving the way for? And so even paying attention to those three, positions as you pay attention to just who's in your circle.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
this isn't just, we're full life integrated people. So this isn't just about professionally, because as I even think on this, I've had people both professionally and personally. The greatest impacts are those that cross both sides of me, so to speak. But I've had people in both places. And I would say too, if you feel like I don't know that I've ever had anybody or whatever, maybe that's something to discern and think of too, and just be like, how can I open myself up to that? How can I make myself available
Mm.
to learn from others and to be impacted by others and not feel like I'm living in a little bubble. So just a lot of reflection this week and a lot of gratefulness as well.
And with that gratitude, I think, it's something we want to do this week as well. And we want to invite you on the journey as Teresa and I are both naming off people. I mean, I'm already thinking, there's some people I'm going to write some notes to or some messages this week. And so we just want to provide some action and say, hey, join us on the journey. And we would love for you to consider, who's someone who's influenced you and has been impactful in your journey as a pioneer, or who's someone maybe that you're encouraging walking ahead of that you would like to invite to come alongside and reach out and just thank them this week or invite them to a connection. You don't know what that connection or that gratitude might mean. And I love those moments. You and I were talking just before we hit record of even the people that have reached out that have read your story. And it
Mhm.
might be I resonate with your personal part of your story, or there's something in the process that hits them. We just had that situation even that was a part of even the email that we sent out last week. Some gentleman at Walmart,
Yeah.
that was like, "Oh, tell me about this book." But
Mhm.
it does provide a way for connection.
Yeah. No, I love that. And yeah, we would just invite you to those things as you reflect. And, before we kind of sign off today, too, I just want to remind you that we have places for you to connect. We have places for you to continue these conversations. If you go to our website at thereallifeprocess.com, click on the little community tab up at the top, and you can join our circle platform. We choose purposely to be off of social media and onto our own private platform, but we have a free community there, where you can continue this conversation and say, "Hey, thanks for the inspiration. It encouraged me to reach out to this person or that person." We'd love to hear that in your story. We do story and life together here in the real life process and through our podcast. I would also encourage you, we have a sister podcast now that if you really want that encouragement from spiritual practices side of things, you can listen to the Real Life Practice podcast. Lindsay Sturkey and I host that podcast, and that's a seasonal podcast. So it's just coming out with season 2, and we're going to be talking about journaling and the practice of journaling and how you use that in your life. Erica, I know you're a journaler. I have become one. So we even talk about that resistance that I've had over the years and how I've leaned into that. And so check out both podcasts, follow and subscribe, whatever they call it right now. That's always helpful for us as we have these kinds of conversations. So, with that, we will sign off with what we do each and every week, which is encouraging you to remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. And maybe your extraordinary moment this week is touching base with someone who's been a pioneer in your life.
Have a great week, everyone.